Hello everyone, here's the Magnavox 9304-20 amp that I took out of an old console. It's actually got three different 6EU7 tubes that are used for the preamps phase, and the output phase is based on the 6BQ5 tubes, and it uses a rectifier tube. It says, what was that guy again? It's a 5U4GB, I believe. That's correct. It has a choke that was already on there, and the output transformers and the power transformer are original to the unit as well. I've done some modifications to this guy though, because as you guys have ever taken one of those old consoles apart, you'll know that it's all tied into the tuner section, and I wanted to make this one look a little nicer. So what we've done to this is I actually found a schematic online. I believe the original amp I had did not have the first input tube there. It only had two tubes, one per channel. This was actually a modification that I found online, and I'll supply the link for that as well once I list this on eBay. But there's a guy named Matt, and I forget his last name, who came up with another schematic. So I pretty much followed his schematic and made a few modifications. He had different output transformers that he'd used on his, but I used the stock ones. Also put two volume knobs on the front and put the Magnavox emblem on the front. And let me show you the back of it here real quick, just to show you what it's looking like. I've got the inputs right there. I put the speaker outputs on the back, behind the output transformers, and have a power cord that's actually coming through the chassis as well. And the other thing is a power switch on the front up here. And it puts some black knobs on there for the volume. And there's the hum knob right there, that's also original, although I can't find that it makes any sort of difference whatsoever. There's one last modification I did to this guy, which I thought was cool, and just to point out too that 100% of the bases on the tubes are new. They're all ceramic on the smaller tubes and a plastic one on the rectifier tube. And all of the electronics have been 100% replaced. Every capacitor, every resistor is all brand new underneath. I had a problem with a couple of the resistors in there, and of course the electrolytics were getting old and making some noise, so I just went ahead and replaced everything. And parts weren't too terribly expensive for that, but it's basically a brand new amp except for the tubes. One other thing to point out as well is the tubes are matched pretty well. I used my ICO 666 tube tester. They're all testing great. Two of the tubes are a little hotter than the other on the output side, although the 6EU7s are pretty well matched. There were two tubes on this unit when I first got it that were weak, two of the original Magnavox tubes. So I went ahead and replaced those with two other 6BQ5s that I had. One of them was an RCA and one of them was a Motorola. I have some other ones, but I use those because they seem to match each other fairly well. And I just realized I've got them plugged in wrong. I've got the original Magnavox tubes there in the middle, and then I think that's the Motorola tube, and this other one's the RCA tube. But you can put those in however you like whenever you get the unit. So I'm going to pull the tubes out for shipping. And the last modification I made is I put blue LEDs underneath the bases of all of the ceramic tubes just to give them a nice look. That's why I did the base in blue as well, the wood that's around it. The wood that's around there is actually oak. Yep, it's coming on now. It's really loud. I've got these hooked up to some Cambridge Soundworks. I think they're Model 6 speakers. I've had these guys forever. Made some modifications to these as well. It's important to note that the output transformers on here are actually 4 ohm. These speakers are 8 ohm, so it should be safe to run those on there, but just be aware that this actually is a 4 ohm amp. So let me go ahead, and I've got my MP3 player plugged into this guy right now. I'll turn it back up. But the separation on this amp's really good. There's very little noise on it. I'm actually quite happy with the way it turned out. I'm going to turn it up all the way, even though it's loud. And while the tubes are cooling off, I pulled out the rectifier and realized the rest of them are just too hot to touch for now. But I wanted to point out one other thing too. I see a lot of these conversion Magnavox chassis out on the internet. And one of the things that always bothers me is they always leave all the holes in there. So I took a couple pieces of metal and actually covered up all the holes. That's where the original capacitor went, but I have them all mounted under the chassis now, and just various other inputs. And there's a couple on the back as well where the old speaker connectors used to be, and the connector came from the tuner. I have those all plugged up, so the top of the chassis is actually pretty shiny. I used some car polish on there, and there are a few blemishes as still in, I guess it's nickel plated on the chassis, but overall it looks really good. Okay, now that the tubes have cooled off, I went ahead and I flipped over the amp just to show you what the inside of the bottom looks like. And there's the new electrolytic capacitors that I replaced, and they were able to fit under the chassis and the original power transformer coming through the bottom. And as I mentioned, I've replaced all the capacitors and all the resistors. Everything's new and at the proper rating. I did actually modify one little thing from the schematic that I copied. They had called for 0.01 microfarad capacitors in a couple places, and I used 0.012 high voltage ones that I already had, so I don't really think that's going to cause too much of a difference. I don't think many of these amps generally have anything on the bottom, but it's fair to note that there are voltages running in excess of about 350 volts or so under here in various locations, so certainly be careful when handling this. And right here where the power connector comes in, there's actually some tape over it to kind of protect you from the mains, but the power switch, I didn't put any tape or anything on there, so those are live 110 volt AC coming in through there. I actually put a suppressor cap over the switch too, which keeps it from popping. I've run this amp probably 10 or so hours now and checked components for any problems, and everything seems to be holding up pretty well, so I don't really anticipate any issues with it. I didn't stain the bottom of the wood, that's what you're seeing there, because you can't really see it anyway. It also has some felt feet that I put on the bottom here, which are just tall enough to keep the screws and the washers from scratching anything that you're setting it on. You might want to replace those, but that's the only ones that I had handy at the time. Okay, last thing I want to show you is these are the original Magnavox 6EU7 tubes that were in there. I tested all of these, as I mentioned before, with my ICO 666 tube tester. They all tested well over good. I think I wrote the numbers down somewhere, and if I can find those, I'll supply them along, but I don't want to go through testing them again because I've already tested them a couple of times now, and they're not perfect matches for each other, but they're actually pretty close, just because it looks like they were in the original amp from day one, and they're probably built around the same day, so I think they've all had about equal amount of wear. These tubes right here are two of the original Magnavox 6BQ5s or EL84 tubes that were in there. These also match pretty well. And as I remember, they were somewhere around 100 to 105 on my tester, which I think anything over 75 on my tester is good, or 60, I forget what the number is. So they're pretty hot. These tubes right here are the ones that I actually replaced, and as you can see, this is actually an RCA black plate tube, and this is a Motorola tube, which these guys tested somewhere around 110 to 115, so they're a little hotter than these other tubes, but it doesn't seem to make a lot of difference. That's part of the reason I went ahead and put separate volume knobs on for each channel, just so you could adjust if you needed to, but these two guys were pretty close to each other as well. And the rectifier is just a standard no-name 5U4GB. This guy actually pegged my tube tester on both of the plates when I tested it, so it seems to be pretty good as well. Just be sure you plug them into the right place. The tube amp is actually labeled on the plate, so it's pretty easy to tell where they go. And I'd probably keep these two Magnavox tubes together and then keep these other two together just to make sure that you've got a pretty close match on them. You can mix it right around and however you like, but that's what I would recommend. Also, these 6EU7s I think are pretty similar to 12AX7 tubes. The way that they're actually laid out, they're just a 6-volt heater instead of a 12-volt heater. But you would have to do some modification to put 12AX7s in there, because I think the pinout's quite a bit different on them, if I remember correctly. So anyway, I'm going to list this out on eBay, and hope you guys are happy with the video. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to email me on eBay once it's listed out there. And happy bidding. Thank you.